When it comes to character design, developing a mascot is a pretty uniquely challenging task. A mascot has to embody a brand, and that goes both ways. A mascot cannot be divorced from the thing it's a mascot for, and for a lot of brands, the mascot is the personification of the brand itself. Think McDonald's and Ronald, or Wendy's and, well, Wendy. Mascots in marketing have recently been a bit of a victim of the increasing push towards minimalism in branding, becoming more and more rare as time goes on and seeing their presence reduced as much as possible, even when things like the Grimace Shake Frenzy show that there's still an appetite for even that weird purple freak. However, in the gaming world, there's a whole different set of incentives and challenges as a result of the character not just embodying a brand in the abstract, but also in a more tangible, interactable way. And my channel members really picked this topic at the perfect time, because in case you missed the last video and haven't really looked at the screen yet, I've also gone through the process of having to redesign a character who needs to be both interactive to the audience and also a mascot for my brand, as it were. So this has been on my mind a bit lately. See, when it comes to video games, mascots come in one of two forms: the intended mascots and the unintended mascots. Intended mascots are the ideal, because they and their associated media were typically purpose-built around them being mascots. Think of characters like Sonic or Crash Bandicoot, who were explicitly designed to serve as mascots for their respective companies in contrast to Mario. Sometimes a mascot isn't really a character in the traditional gaming sense either. Jimbo the non-drag clown is the mascot for Balatro, despite not being a playable character in the most literal sense. The much more fraught side of it all are the unintended mascots. Characters who weren't really meant to be the mascot, but had the role thrust upon them as a consequence of either their media property or the character themselves becoming uniquely popular or iconic. A character like Master Chief probably wasn't intended to be as big of a mascot as he was, given that Microsoft's strategy at the time was just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, but he was still designed with the intent of being a mascot. That's not really what we're talking about here either. See, in single-player games, or at least ones with a significant single-player component, the protagonist is typically going to become the mascot by default. Think Master Chief, think Bayonetta, think Phoenix Wright. And you might say, well, duh, of course the main character is going to be the mascot, what's your point? And my point is that that's not always actually the case. For one, what happens if there is no singular main character? Overwatch doesn't have a main character, but it still has had mascots. Initially Tracer, but with Sojourn being pushed as the initial Overwatch 2 mascot, and then more recently I think it's fair to say it's been Kiriko. For another, what happens when the main character isn't really a singular defined character, but something customizable? Baldur's Gate 3's mascot, if there could be one, is the Tav, but that's definitionally not a constant character. What happens when the main character just isn't the most iconic character of their franchise? Like, the mascot of Danganronpa isn't Makoto, Hajime, Kaede, or Shuichi. It's Monokuma and Junko. And for this video, I want to talk about the characters who are forced to fill the shoes of the mascot for their franchises, companies, or platforms, and whose characters were actively damaged by the necessity of filling this role. The mascotization of a character is a difficult balancing act, and whether it succeeds or fails in any given instance, it is a fascinating insight into what's going on with how producers, publishers, and publics interact with and interpret the characters they know and or love. Part 1. Making a mascot. The best place to start is, obviously, at the beginning of the process. How do you make a mascot? How do you make a character who is synonymous with the brand, the personification of your brand identity? Well, for one, you need a character who can embody what you envision your brand to be about. Mario is cheerful and goofy, with a smile on his face and an unrelenting enthusiasm for whatever is coming. His games are fun, lighthearted affairs where he's solving the world's problems while being a bit of a lovable goober. And he represents a brand, a company, that is meant to be family fun. Pikachu is an adorable fantasy creature that will say its own name at you to communicate anything from kindness to violence. Its games are all about fantasy creatures that you both befriend and battle with. If we look outside of video games, we can see that with stuff like fast food mascots. Ronald McDonald is a clown, sincerely attempting to portray a welcoming, fun environment where things are meant to be instantly enjoyable and done right so fast that you don't even really notice it. Burger King is a king because you're eating like a king. You're not paying for the fastest, cheapest thing, you're paying for the king's experience, in theory. Wendy's is a simple, down-home, regular girl. You're getting the girl next door of fast food, where it's better than you realized and more accessible and enjoyable than some fancy king or goofy clown. This is hard to do well. Famously, Sega was fighting for its fucking life to come up with anything that could stand up to Mario. There's an absolute graveyard of characters who all attempted to be their mascot, and you can go through a litany of, frankly, pretty garbage games to find them all if you ever decide that you hate yourself enough for it. Sonic emerged on top because he was fast, cool, edgy, and fun. He seemed more modern than the relatively slow and pokey Mario with his sharp edges, fast talking, and high speeds. He matched what people thought 90s kids wanted. Same with characters like Crash Bandicoot, who were more goofy than the comparatively cool Sonic, but still cooler than Mario. Regardless, the point is that nailing the mascot formula is genuinely really, really hard. it's just gonna always be hard to personify an entire brand in a way that appeals to a wide range of people. And that last bit is the especially hard part, because it's not like it's hard to appeal to some people. My old mascot appealed to some people, as does my current one. It's kind of the point. He is functionally my mascot as well as my brand. However, I'm not trying to appeal to everyone, and that's by design. I want to be able to talk about certain topics on this channel, and I do not want to attract the kinds of audience that would be very annoying at me about them. This model repels a lot of those people because they think VTubing is cringe, which it is, and that cringe is bad, which it isn't. Sometimes. Depends how hot the cringe is, to be honest. The point is, my model works for what I use him for as a mascot, but that comes with the clear caveat that this also limits my appeal. And he would be fucking atrocious as a mascot for a fast food restaurant or a video game franchise. Like, you can't be putting gay bulges on the box art unless you want to get firebombed by a libs of TikTok stan. And yet, it's not impossible. You can still make a mascot with broad appeal to your target demographic. You just need to be able to distill them down into something iconic to the audience and representative of everything you're trying to say about whatever it is they're a mascot for. Tracer wasn't a bad pick for this with Overwatch 1. She's quirky and fun and friendly and hopeful and cool and exists at that intersection of sci-fi and fantasy where you get the technology that's so advanced that it's functionally indistinguishable from magic, all of which is a pretty good encapsulation of Overwatch 1. And she was pretty famously successful as the Overwatch mascot for a good while, getting lumped in along the likes of Chun-Li in pop culture. Or at least in Ready Player One, which I don't think counts, but we're gonna pretend it does for now. But that's not the end of the story either. Succeeding as a mascot is one thing, but what happens to the characters themselves in the process? Part 2. Ruining a character. The short answer is that this process often serves to ruin a character as it goes on, and this happens in two main stages. The first stage is that the character who was picked because of how they embody these important aspects of the brand are now reduced down to just those elements. Tracer becomes the world could always use more heroes character when she's the mascot, and over time, everything else gets worn away from how she's perceived. The second is that the creators start to lean into that, choosing only to portray her as this corny, the world could always use more heroes character when that aspect of her was only ever interesting in the first place because of how it slotted into the bigger picture of her personality. This is a process that's often referred to as Flanderization in media, named for Ned Flanders in The Simpsons. Early Simpsons seasons portrayed Ned as a fuller character, with meaningful personality traits and pathos, and a complicated, entertaining worldview that you would see crash into reality like a fucking bulldozer every once in a while. However, over time, the writing leaned into the caricature of Ned Flanders that had been created in people's minds, simplifying him down into just hi diddly ho neighborino and some Jesus shit. Flanderization affects a lot of characters in The Simpsons and beyond, but it's especially potent when it comes to any character that could become a mascot because the incentives that exist with mascots all push you towards Flanderization. And this can be fine if the character doesn't need to be any more than that. Ronald McDonald doesn't need to be more than what he is. Pikachu is ultimately fungible, meaning that he can be a mascot without risk. But Tracer, she's not like that. She's meant to be a normal person who became a hero, an embodiment of the idea that anyone can be a hero, and that the world could always use more of them. However, she needs to be a normal person at the core in order for that message to work. She needs to be the anyone who could be a hero, but this process of mascotization turns her into the opposite as a hero that anyone could be. It's a distinction that matters. It emphasizes her hero-ness over her humanness, and the possibility to become her over the relatability of being fundamentally similar to who she is at her core. This sort of thing affects any character who has to represent a brand, especially when they exist in contrast to other characters who might not have the same obligation. Ronald McDonald doesn't have to compete with anyone who's more fully fleshed out. Outside of his own brand, he's competing with Wendy and the King, who are in a similar position. And within his own brand, he's competing with characters like Grimace, who are also meant to be pretty surface level. VTubers are on a baseline equal footing with one another on this front too, since we all have to use our models as our personal brands, meaning that even when we get oversimplified down to some degree, we're still operating within a context where everyone else is also being oversimplified down to that same general degree. Plus, VTubers are the whole thing. We're just representing ourselves and our content with our mascots, so it's pretty easy to keep that in mind. Fast food mascots have to represent a whole brand, but they also don't really need to have a personality beyond their design. Like, the design has to communicate everything that you need to know about them. Video game characters have the worst of both worlds when they're an ensemble cast in particular. Tracer not only has to carry the Overwatch brand, flanderizing her in the process, but she also has to coexist alongside characters who aren't burdened by mascotization, and so can exist more fully, which only hurts Tracer more by comparison. The TLDR of this section is that this process ruins a character by reducing them down to something simple and devoid of nuance for the purposes of quick, clear communication, flanderizing them in the process even if their depth was part of what made them so emblematic of the brand in the first place. It's a trade-off of individual character depth for brand recognition, and sometimes it can work out in the end. Mario is probably the best example of this being done successfully because Mario is a fundamentally simple character existing in an ensemble of characters who aren't also particularly deep. and that his presentation is shifted depending on whether or not he's functionally the host of an event versus an actual protagonist. And importantly, ruining the character also does ruin their capacity to be a mascot in cases like Tracer. By flanderizing her, you remove the secondary parts of her character that were necessary for her to be useful as a mascot. An arguably even better example of this is Junko Enoshima and Monokuma in Danganronpa, where the flanderization of both of them as mascots is explicitly critiqued in Danganronpa V3. Splitting Monokuma into 5 mini-mascots who are meant to revitalize his brand while keeping Monokuma around only leads to the obnoxious Monokubs that nobody really liked taking up too much time, and Junko Enoshima always being behind it all is treated as an in-universe trope that's so played out it's cliché. The problem with this is that Junko originally became a mascot because she has an amazing design and a really, really compelling character and personality. And spoilers for Trigger Happy Havoc ahead, I guess, but I mean, if you haven't already played it, I think the ship's probably sailed for you a little bit there. Part of what made her so initially iconic was that she was just a cool character who died early on to send a message, and then it turned out she was always masterminding the whole thing. She was brash and bold and obnoxious and pretty cool, blending her brilliance with her social abilities to get away with so much more than anyone would expect from her. In another world, she would have gone on a fucking tear through the reality competition show circuit. She was eventually defeated by Hope, but even that defeat served her ultimate purpose of utter despair. And then she comes back. Again and again and again. And each time, the trick gets less impactful, to the point that V3 explicitly calls out the lack of impact. She's no longer the brilliant trickster who pulled it all off right under everyone's noses and they were never the wiser. She's this omnipotent mastermind, incapable of being stopped but also incapable of expressing depth. She's no longer masterminding the killing game between her classmates, she's just doing it to random people she doesn't really care about. She's no longer using the deaths of her friends to further her own despair, which renders a lot of her investment in it moot beyond just sadistic satisfaction at a killing game. That was never her character. I mean, don't get me wrong, she loved a killing game, but she specifically wanted to be trapped with her classmates and her sister because that would maximize her own despair. Every subsequent game where she's the mastermind pulls her further and further away from that. So what do you do when your mascot's been ruined? Part 3. Making a mascot. Historically, this problem was pretty easy to avoid. You just make an intentionally simple character like Mario who doesn't really run the risk of having to be ruined, or having anything that could be ruined in that way. However, that doesn't really cut it for modern gaming where expectations have changed. You typically need a character with enough of a compelling character to actually want to play them and their game, so you need to find ways to compensate for this issue. Sometimes you can still pull a Mario and get away with it, where he's basically just a vehicle for his more interesting friends and more interesting gameplay mechanics to exist around him, but that's not as common in the AAA space given that the illusion of depth that so many of these games strive for is directly at odds with that sort of mascot. More commonly, you make the biggest mistake that you can make. Replace the mascot. The old one isn't hitting like they used to, so it's time for a new one. Either a brand new one designed to succeed the old one, or a backbencher being pulled up to the front row. The added difficulty here is that you have to also pick a character who represents a meaningful break from your old mascot. You can't just pick Tracer again if you're going to do this, you're going to have to pick someone who looks, sounds, acts, and is instantly recognizable as a distinct character for a distinct era of your game. Overwatch 1's mascot was primarily Tracer, with Soldier being kind of a secondary one for the early days of the game, but Tracer was the big one. However, in Overwatch 2, Sojourn was the initial mascot. They moved from 2 white heroes to a black hero, from a British woman and an American man to a Canadian woman, from a peppy optimist and a worn-down soldier to an old soldier who still believes in fighting the good fight. Part of what can make this especially hard is that old mascots aren't really easily excised from a piece of media. It's hard to know how to make a Mario Kart if you don't include Mario, you know? Games like Danganronpa get around this by having 2 separate mascot characters, Junko and Monokuma, who serve different purposes as mascots of the series. Monokuma can be the explicit constant, whereas Junko's mascot role is a bit more of a meta role. If you ask the characters in universe, Monokuma is the mascot, not Junko. But if you ask people IRL, Junko is undoubtedly a series mascot, if not the biggest one, especially given how she's being used in the games. Tracer is still in Overwatch and all its marketing from the old days, and you can't just get rid of all the iconic lines that she used to be delivering all over the marketing materials. So, you emphasize what's different about your new mascot. You emphasize that Sojourn isn't like Tracer, or even like Soldier, but instead she's someone with a bit more nuance to her. She's not as oversimplified as they were, with their generic tropes and the archetypes that they filled. She's representative of the next era of Overwatch and what the in-universe organization will stand for as they move into their own next era. But like, we've been here before, haven't we? Part 4. Ruining a character. Yeah, so now you run into the same problem as before. Your new mascots are going to go through the same process as the old ones, only now it's exacerbated by the fact that some people never like the new ones for any number of reasons, and that you're fighting the power of nostalgia for the old one in the process. This is especially rough for a character like Sojourn, whose commitment to nuance and being relatively understated makes her kind of a poor mascot. Not a bad character to be clear, but just your mascot kinda can't be fundamentally nuanced. A complicated worldview doesn't fit on a billboard, and people don't want to have to put in the work to humanize a billboard either. Tracer had depth, but she also had a clear character on the surface level. Sojourn really kinda doesn't, at least not one that's as big and bold as Tracer. And so mascotification only serves to highlight the lack of surface level character while also kind of bulldozing through the depth that she does have. What's more, a new mascot is fighting an uphill battle on several fronts. It tends to get associated with everything negatively received about the changes rather than the positive ones, and everything about the old versions will be perceived through a more positive lens in contrast. Sojourn gets associated with everything negative about Overwatch 2 when it releases, while Tracer is emblematic of the good old days. And unlike Tracer, Sojourn really didn't have runway to build good vibes. Tracer had a bunch of cinematics and lore and pre-release hype where she wasn't really competing with pre-existing characters, whereas Sojourn was competing with the Overwatch 1 characters and lore from the jump. She wasn't integrated into the lore as much as the others were, aside from a handful of references in the event-only story missions that would roll around once a year, and she wasn't highlighted in the way that Tracer was with Alive or the Museum Attack cinematic. This is the case basically anywhere where mascots are being used. If any new McDonald's mascot got rolled out, it would immediately be compared to Ronald McDonald, and specifically in a context in which Ronald represents everything people once liked about the brand and the new mascot represents everything that they hate about it now. With my new VTuber model, the old one almost immediately becomes representative of all my old content and what people liked about videos like the Inescapable one or whatever. And the new one represents, well, whatever I'm doing now, I guess. The old one represented all these really fun games that I played with my viewers, but the new one represents nothing. Yet. Especially in the short term, it's a major PR battle and it's a hard one to win. You have to flood the zone with new stuff to replace the old one in people's consciousness, like how I'm pumping out a ton of videos with the new model this month. But even then, you're basically just hoping to force a draw while you build the new mascot's reputation. Basically, in effect, every issue that a mascot like Tracer faces is just amplified by an order of magnitude for whoever her replacement is. And that includes the acceleration of the damage to the character. Not only does mascotification serve to ruin the character in and of itself, but also it's going to be held in direct contrast with an ex-mascot, who's now benefiting both from nostalgia as well as being given the room to breathe that she wasn't as a mascot. A replacement mascot gets put on the chopping block and outlives their utility super fast. And what does that mean? Part 5. Making a mascot. So now it's time to find a way to replace your mascot once again. The same process repeats as before, but with a new twist. Now there's an original mascot that you could choose to call back to. Tracer could become Overwatch's mascot once again, now reborn in the minds of the fans as a result of having half a decade off from being the mascot to recover from her flanderization. However, that can also be an admission of failure on the replacement mascot, and risks ruining the nostalgia that accompanied the old mascot's identity. An overthrown mascot is one that's also free from the short-term disappointments that can emerge, and in the case of a game like Overwatch, they can come to represent the golden age of the game in a way that can be ruined pretty fast by re-embracing them as a mascot. So, instead, you find somebody new. Maybe somebody who wasn't originally intended to be a mascot, but clearly was popular. Or maybe someone that was kind of manufactured specifically to fill the role of the mascot, getting lots of cosmetics and attention and crossovers and making a lot of money for them. I am, of course, talking about Kiriko. The problem with Kiriko is that while, yes, she does have a lot of both surface level character and depth to go alongside it, similar to Tracer, she's also just a lot more polarizing than Tracer basically ever was. Swapping to Kiriko would highlight the surface level personality that so many people find aggravating while flanderizing her depth even more, and that's really not something you can afford to do with her. But like, who else would you pick? Juno's clearly kind of in the running now, but she's probably never actually going to be picked because she's a little too detached from everything. Wu Yang is also clearly being pushed a little bit right now, given how they've been monetizing him so aggressively right out the jump and integrating him immediately into the centerpiece of a major collab. Mercy's kind of an ever-present fallback option in case nothing else works, but she's also pretty polarizing by now, and that just isn't the best idea, maybe. It's better to leave her where she is. You could also always pull a wild card. Winston's always kind of been a bit of a low-tier mascot, I guess, and ever since the Winton stuff popped off, he's been a meme mascot, but as soon as you try and embrace that as an actual mascot, as a brand, you kind of ruin it, because, you know, no joke is funny once the brands start doing it. Speaking of... Part 6. Ruining a character. Regardless of what you do now, you've replaced your mascot too many times. You are HBO renaming itself a billion times. Even if you do go back to your original name, everyone thinks you're a big dumb stupid idiot who can't figure their shit out. You've spent all this money on rebranding only to fail, admit your failure by trying to rebrand again, and then failing again and repeating this process until any goodwill is gone. You keep ruining characters, you keep entering new and exciting flop eras, you keep dropping the ball. Now, the issue is no longer the mascot. It's the fact that you don't seem to have any sort of tangible identity for people to latch onto, and you seem desperate to communicate a brand to people without knowing what that brand even is. A VTuber who constantly rebrands is making it impossible to attach to any identity. A fast food chain that constantly rebrands is making it clear that they're just trying and failing to chase trends. A video game that tries to constantly turn to other characters as substitute mascots makes it clear that they don't really see their characters as characters or understand what would actually represent their game. For a game like Overwatch, every time this process is being repeated, it just drags more characters down and it hurts the reputation of the game as a whole. And yet, you can't just have no mascot for your hero shooter, right? What do you do next? You keep ruining characters, but you don't seem to be able to pick one that works, so do you just keep trying? Do you give up? Do you walk into the ocean and pray that the waves either take you to the answer or take you away from it all? Part 7. Do you get what the bit here is yet, or do I have to repeat the same two titles again? The problem with the mascotization of characters is that too many companies don't understand that mascots aren't really supposed to be characters. They're brands. Mario is a brand. Pikachu is a brand. Tracer is not a brand. There's no iconography, there's no symbols, there's not even really a particularly compelling piece of equipment or a silhouette or anything that they've leaned on in the last decade at this point. The mascot isn't really supposed to be the characters themselves, it's what represents them, and by proxy, the game that they're a part of. It's the silhouette of Pikachu's head or tail. It's the M on Mario's red hat. It's the Master Chief's helmet. It's what fits on the logo. Mario, Master Chief, Pikachu, they can all have plenty of depth depending on what they're up to, but that isn't a separate role to their role as a mascot. The Pikachu that exists as a mascot isn't the same as Ash's Pikachu, they're just both the same species. Master Chief's helmet is distinctive and iconic, but it's representative of his role as Master Chief. A piece of equipment, not the human being who wears it. And that works because the human being who wears it functionally might as well be his equipment, and that's part of his whole thing. Mario is a mascot in any scenario where he's not a protagonist. In Mario Kart or Mario Party, he's basically the host of the event, not really a character. I think this is why a lot of people think it's kind of lame if you pick Mario in any of those games. Like, in those ones, he's in mascot mode. In Mario Sunshine or Galaxy or Odyssey, he's in character mode, it's different. Whenever you're turning a regular character into a mascot, it needs to be a character that you are willing to fully sacrifice to mascothood. It's like how a monarch is meant to be a symbol more than a human being. In fact, it was a big part of what allowed for Elizabeth II to keep the English monarchy alive while so many European monarchies lost their power and their privilege and their positions. She wasn't a person for all intents and purposes, she was a mascot for the United Kingdom. She symbolized the British spirit with her personhood being secondary in importance. That's also a big part of the issue for King Charles. He's been too insistent on putting his humanness first, both in terms of expressing his own individual personhood as well as creating personal drama. When people think of Charles, they think of Diana. Either that, or more recently, his pedophile brother. And as someone who's very much so not a fan of the monarchy, I kinda hope they continue this trend of ruining their only real utility so we can maybe get rid of them sometime. Also, not everyone has to love a mascot, especially in the short term. They don't need to be everyone's favorite character. Like, Mario shouldn't really be your favorite Mario Party character or favorite Mario Kart character. It's arguably better if he isn't. That way, there's nothing being lost to the mascotization of him. He is a character for whom your personal feelings are kind of irrelevant. You're not mad about him being on the cover of a game in the same way you're not mad at Ronald McDonald being on your McDonald's bag. He represents all the characters he brings with him. He represents a vibe. He represents an aesthetic, a sentiment. He's hosting the Mario Party, and that's what you might like him for. And this could have worked for Overwatch with Tracer. She was, all things considered, a pretty good mascot. In fact, as a character, there were some ways in which she was being served better by being a mascot. It highlighted the strengths of her surface level character while inviting people to consider looking into her more and taking her more seriously. That's part of the advantage of being a long-term mascot as well. Eventually, if people like your shit enough, they'll start to look a little bit deeper into it. As a non-mascot, though, she's really only been left behind more and more, and there's been nobody capable of really taking up the mantle. The right way to handle things with her was always, frankly, just to update her design and focus on iterating on her in the same way that Pikachu, Master Chief, Mario, Ronald McDonald, fucking every other successful mascot gets updated. This is part of why I'm glad I can actually tie it into the video about sequel redesigns, because this does tie into the point about the 2.0 design for my model. If I'd come out with a brand new, wholly unrecognizable character with new colors and new iconography and a whole new concept, that would have been bad. Like, I recognize this is already a bit of a reach, but at least the family resemblance is there. Swapping to a new character concept altogether, new name, new branding, new everything, would have hurt my brand identity and also just undermined all the work that had gone into building that brand with the 1.0. And the same thing happens when you keep hopping around to new mascots within a roster and just praying one of them eventually sticks. But it's also worth recognizing that sometimes it's kind of a lose-lose situation. Danganronpa is in an unwinnable scenario when it comes to Junko, a character who is iconic and excellent, but also even just the act of making her a series mascot is kind of de facto a spoiler for Trigger Happy Havoc. Bringing her back again and again is hard to resist because she's a great antagonist and an enduring symbol of the game's despair themes, but on the flip side, it robs every future antagonist of their own space to act while also making the story way too predictable. Like, it worked once. Goodbye Despair jumped the shark a bit, but the themes of that game made it mostly play out okay. But by the time we got to V3, it was literally a major theme of the ending that it's always Junko, and there's not really a way to avoid it. Either you embrace your iconic characters and accept their flanderization, or you neglect your obviously central characters and fail to capitalize on the momentum around them. Junko's character perception has been hurt by her mascotification. People don't understand that she genuinely did love her classmates in the first game, and the whole reason why she did what she did was because seeing them suffer did cause her unbelievable despair, which in turn was thrilling for her. She wasn't just mindlessly sadistic. That's why she didn't really care a great deal about what happened to the Goodbye Despair student so long as she got her way. Thankfully, for Danganronpa, you have the option of a literal, teddy bear mascot in the form of Monokuma who can bear the brunt of that. Pun kind of intended. But that also only works because Monokuma himself is so iconic. Other Kodaka franchises like Master Detective Archive or The 100 Line have their own Monokumas in the form of Shinigami and Sirei respectively, but they don't really work quite as well. And that's to say nothing of the many games that try and fail to pull off a Danganronpa-esque villain plus mascot reveal and kind of flop. Process of elimination is overall pretty good, but I could not describe the Quartering Duke's appearance to you if you held a gun to my head. And the character that gets closest to Junko in terms of vibes and iconicness doesn't really live all that long. Your Turn to Die has some very fun floor masters with interesting, cool designs, but they are actively meant to be disposable by the narrative, which makes it hard for any of them to really be a mascot. And some of them, even if they do survive, you don't see them very often. Inescapable had the De Winter sisters, and the less said about them, the better. Zero Escape has Zero in all of their iterations, which... mixed bag, we'll say, about the Zeros. But do you know which franchises don't have to worry about stuff like this? Shit like Mario. Mario has endured as a mascot because Nintendo has always presented him first and foremost as a mascot. There have been times where he's been more cool or less cool, but they have stuck with him because they know that that's essential for the mascot. Once you start trying to swap out a new one to capitalize on trends or try to compete with someone else's mascot, you start losing. I mean, sure, sometimes you end up with a good mascot at the end of all of this process. Look at Sonic. Kinda. But also look at the absolute highway of mascot corpses that were created and then abandoned in order to get to him. And also, look at where Sega and Nintendo stand relative to each other now. Could Nintendo have come up with a cooler, better mascot than Mario? Yeah, probably eventually. They have lots of characters, lots of very iconic ones that they could have gone with. But that didn't make Mario the wrong choice. When it comes to a mascot, you need to make one and stick with it. And Nintendo understood that in a way that so many other companies just don't. Tracer was a good mascot, and it would have been better for them if they'd stuck with her. That doesn't mean she has to be as static as Mario has been over the years. Her design can still be updated, but at the end of the day, it should still be her. That's not to say that it was perfect for her character. Like I said, it did cause some flanderization. It wasn't the best for her depth. It didn't always help bring out the most in her character. But sometimes that's a price worth paying. And I would argue with Tracer, it was better to keep paying that price than to keep dragging more characters down with her. And that's not to say that this process is easy to get right. Sometimes the mascotification of a character does more harm than good, even if it is the natural pick. Again, look at Junko. And sometimes you also pick a dud of a mascot on your first go round. Again, look at Inescapable. However, that's why it's so important to put in the work to try and get it right. Having gone through that process recently myself for this model update, I understand that what I'm talking about isn't as simple as just, why not make it good? Or what if you just did it right? It's obviously harder than that. I understand that. And I want to emphasize that this video is focusing more on the most avoidable pitfall in mascot design. Namely, trying to constantly do too much and change out your mascot to chase an audience. Your mascot is your signature. You can occasionally update it, but it should remain consistent enough that it is recognizable, identifiable, and representative of you. Alternatively, I guess you could just run through your entire roster like a 24-year-old Instigate running through a friend group on Fire Island and see what happens next. Hasn't worked so far for Blizzard, but hey, I'm sure by the time they get desperate enough to try using Sombra as a mascot, it'll finally work out for them. And that's where this video is going to end. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. If you haven't already heard, I'm doing a donathon right now to celebrate my 2.0 model debut, so if you want a piece of some of these rewards, you should consider contributing. Any contributions made during the month of October, including the few days that have passed before I officially announced it, on YouTube, Patreon, Twitch, or as a direct donation through the link in the description will be counted towards both individual and community goals. Memberships also count towards that. My channel members give $5 or more a month to support the channel and earn the right to vote for one topic a month for me to make a video on. And this month, they also count towards the donathon. This video was selected by my channel members in July and was delayed a bit because of the abomination that was the defensive V3 video, but the plan is to be all caught up on the rest of them by the end of November. And that includes the next one as well, which is being voted on right now. The topics are: how buried stars get social media toxicity right, This video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. What does it mean to perform poorly? This video would be about how we evaluate performance and how our understanding of performance metrics is counterintuitive, both in gaming spaces and beyond. What's the price of a game? This video would be about the discussion people are having about the price of Switch games, AAA games, and indie games, focusing on what it even means to try and decide what the price of a game should be. Oblivion, Skyrim, and how limitations can make games better. This video would argue that Oblivion's relatively more restrictive gameplay and mechanics actually allow the player to make more choices and explore more freedom than Skyrim's open-ended approach to skills, combat, and progression. Voting on this poll will be open until the end of the day on October 10th, and if you want to become a member, you can do so for $5 a month on Patreon or YouTube at the links in the description. My channel members not only play a huge role in supporting the content, but also are a big part of why I was able to afford to make this model upgrade. If you'd like to join them and contribute to the donathon in the process, make sure to become a member to vote for one of those topics. Finally, thank you very much to all my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele and Robot Juice. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise and Jatenar, Bailey Nichols, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, Theo, and NJD. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavoss, Crimson Cyclo, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dodley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deco _ Safan, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Teo Tamara, Please Like Me, and Puddinsis. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again sometime soon.